Hey everyone, welcome back. This will be Peeling Syd Barrett, and in this episode I would like to discuss Effervescing Elephant, an Effervescing Elephant, episode 27. Now when I initially picked this song, I started thinking about it, and as I normally do, started kind of mulling some of the symbolism that Mr. Barrett uses, and I've kind of come to the realization that this song actually means something vastly different than what I thought it meant when I started, which is, in my interpretation anyway. Of course, all these things are subjective, and in trying to understand them, I'm trying to look at them from what I suppose Mr. Barrett's point of view may have been, and there's no way of knowing that for sure. So, I'm going to run through a discussion on this, and I'm going to talk through some of the symbolism and what the meaning, the secondary meaning of the song may mean, and that may drastically change your understanding of this song. So, spoiler warning. Okay, I've never done this before, but spoiler warning. This song, if you really love this song, and it's a very happy, positive song for you, as is the common conception of the song, then I'll say maybe you shouldn't watch this particular episode, because your understanding of the song is likely going to change quite deeply. And I don't want to take away the enjoyment of this song from anyone. If you are the kind of person who derives a form of satisfaction from the challenge of understanding these things, and perhaps could derive a greater understanding of the song and thereby appreciate it more, then please by all means continue on. But spoiler alert, okay, I'm just going to say that the popular perception of this song may be deeply incorrect. That's all I'll say. Okay? So let's go ahead and move on. And what I normally do is I call out mistakes or corrections from previous episodes. And there's two things. One is that the previous episode, which was called King of Paint, we discussed the Red Rooster painting that Mr. Barrett made. And I was going back through some of the previous episodes, just thinking about them. And for some reason, I rewatched Painting Black. And it dawned on me that perhaps the song Paint It Black may have influenced Mr. Barrett. And he may have conceived of the notion of a red door being painted black. And that red door may be the painting Red Rooster. I had never thought of it that way before, and it just kind of hit me. But I do wonder if there isn't a very, very deep meaning tied to that painting, and that would enable someone to perhaps decode or understand Mr. Barrett better and his situation and his history. So we discussed the options of that within the episode King of Paint. So I guess if you are interested, I'll suggest you go back and watch that and consider the discussion about Red Rooster and how that may be a doorway into Mr. Barrett's psyche or personality or life experience, and how it may tie in with a song like Paint It Black. I don't know if he contributed to the song Paint It Black. You can go back and watch a Painting Black if you like, to discuss the long history of that terminology, if you like, if you're so inclined. And perhaps that'll give you a little bit more understanding of what I'm talking about. The other thing is we've had a bunch of people join. That's pretty cool. And I don't normally call people out, but I do like when people kind of make comments, and especially if they have kind of constructive things to say about the topic. Sometimes it helps me out. It helps me look at things in a new way. And it's also cool to see other people are interested in this topic. Personally, I haven't really gone into this, but obviously I think Mr. Barrett was a genius lyrically. And I haven't really discussed my personal opinions about him too much. I'll just say that I do believe he was a flawed person, but there were a lot of admirable qualities about him that I think people have misunderstood. And I do also think that his work is much more extensive than most people realize, hence the Did Syd series, even if that's just influencing other people in some fashion. I don't think people recognize the value of his work. The second correction I'd kind of like to make is that I do call people out with comments and try to discuss their comments sometimes in the episodes. If I mispronounce a name or mess up a pronoun because I'm not familiar with the name, I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what else to say other than I make mistakes sometimes. So I do not intend to mess up the pronunciation of anyone's name or mess up their pronouns. And I would just like to point out that the pronoun bit is going to be very important for this episode, and you'll see why in a little while. Okay? So what I would like to do then is kind of discuss the Effervescing Elephant. So what I would like you to do is I'm going to suggest you go check out Mr. Bobinski's video. Again, no affiliation with me, and I'm not affiliated with him. He doesn't get anything from this. I don't get anything from his videos. I just really like his animation. I think his video accurately captures the general pop conception of this song. And you can see a lot of interviews with people that knew Mr. Barrett. And by Mr. Barrett, I mean Roger Syd Barrett, not his father. And they all discuss how he was just this happy-go-lucky kind of bouncy guy. And it's a perfect song for him because he's just like an effervescing elephant, this kind of bubbly, positive personality, and how he drastically changed at some point in time. I want you to keep that in mind when you watch the video. You can pull up lyrics or whatever on the side if you like, and I want to discuss the song, but I really, really do suggest you watch Mr. Bobinski's video to get a feel for kind of what's going on. All right? So if you would, go ahead and do that, and I'm going to pull up the lyrics, and we'll come back and we'll discuss things, okay? Okay, so hopefully you had time to check that out, and I'm going to talk through a few things. Now, the first of them is that the very title, Effervescing Elephant, is noted by quite a few people as being, I guess you could say, a very notable aspect of Mr. Barrett. So let's just kind of run through this, and then we'll see what we say. Now, there's 4 characters in the story that are kind of expanded on. The rest of the animals, which we've discussed already, that Mr. Barrett likes to compare people to animals and singular people to animals. So there is an effervescing elephant, and there are descriptives for the effervescing elephant. The elephant is effervescing or positive, bouncy, bubbly. So let's write all those down. He has tiny eyes, and again now, he or she, I guess, there's no identifier yet. Tiny eyes and a great big trunk. So that could mean, of course, a big nose. And so those are the traits of the elephant. Now then, that elephant whispers into the ear of an inferior. Who that inferior is, I don't know. I believe in the Bobinski video, he whispers into the ear of a mouse or something like that, which may be appropriate, but I just want to point out it doesn't say really what kind of animal. It just says inferior. So the inferior one has tiny ears, right? The tiny ear of the inferior. And he whispers that by next June, he'd die. Okay, so here's the first pronoun problem. And I just want to point out that the popular perception of this is, of course, that the effervescing elephant is warning this inferior one, this little one, that the little one is going to die. But what may be discussed is he'd die. Who is he'd? Of course, it could also be the elephant. The elephant may be warning the younger one, the inferior one, the smaller one, that the elephant is going to die. Okay? Which is a big step, and it's a little bit disturbing if you know the history of Mr. Barrett, and we'll get into why that may be the case in a bit. So, let's continue on. He mentions that the tiger would roam. Of course, the tiger in many stories is a kind of a vicious killer, a destructive force. It is the embodiment of death in many stories, including a lot of British literature, like Kipling and his stories about Mowgli and Shere Khan. and I will also mention William Blake. We'll get into those later. So for now, let's just suffice that the tiger's kind of messed up. So the little one says, oh no, I have to stay at home. Now, if you go with the pop or general or initial reaction, you're thinking that the little one is saying that because he needs to stay safe and stay away from the tiger. I just want to point out, if this is the elephant saying that the elephant is going to die, why would the little one have to stay at home? And of course, the possibility then is that the little one is reacting and saying, oh my goodness, you're going to die. I have to stay home with you. Okay? And that is quite important. And I'll get into that in just a bit. And so then the next bit is, every time that the little one hears a growl, the tiger's on the prowl. Now, I just want to point out that the two previous lines, roam and home, if you mix that with growl and prowl, in particular growl, you can get the word groan. So every time I hear a groan, I know the tiger's on the prowl, which could mean that the elephant is groaning. That's kind of an implied, subconsciously combination of words. Perhaps it's just a coincidence. You'll have to decide. I just want to point out that the roam and home, when you throw that in together with growl, you're going to get groan. Okay? So the tiger's on the prowl, and then the little one says, I'll be really safe, because the elephant told me so. Okay, so let's take a break really quick, and I want to point you to a book. Just a break from the lyrics. Now, this is a very irregular head. I've told you before by Mr. Rob Chapman that he's probably my favorite for defining personalities in these stories. For some reason, he is very good at capturing, I would say, the essence of people. So on page 43, he defines the death of Max Barrett. And I guess, well, no, not 43. I'm sorry. My fault. On page 31. So on page 31, he defines the death of Mr. Max Barrett, who was a doctor, by the way. And this was on 11 December 1961, which would have made Mr. Barrett 15 years old, I believe. So this 15-year-old boy has been trying to deal with the slow death to cancer of his father. On the next page, Mr. Barrett's girlfriend at the time relays the story of going to the Barrett's house and sometimes hearing Mr. Barrett, Max Barrett, yelling out in pain. And of course, I guess you could say the Barrett household was known kind of for being withdrawn and personal. And so the idea that this man is suffering in solitude and loneliness is a little bit heartbreaking, to be honest. So now we have a reason now to understand the second possibility, which is that this is actually about the little one, the inferior one, recognizing that the elephant is going to die, and the elephant knows it as well. So he's telling the little one, I'll be really safe, because the elephant told me so. In other words, don't worry, son, everything's going to be okay. You're going to be all right. And that's really kind of a heartbreaking idea, to think that this poor man is dying and has a young son and has young children, and perhaps they're not ready for him to leave yet, and he doesn't really have a choice. So let's, I guess, go ahead and continue on. It's just kind of a really hard one to stomach, frankly. And I'll point you to our episode on the boy and the lion, and of course the painting that Mr. Barrett made of the lions, and how that may show a man walking into the doorway or walking towards death, and we identify that person as a man because he's wearing blue. So that may be a representation of his father, and it may have deeply affected Mr. Barrett, Syd Barrett. Okay, so let's continue on with the song. Everyone was nervy. In other words, everyone's nervous, and the message was spread around to all the other animals, zebra, mongoose, hippopotamus. Of course, these are African and Indian animals, and that makes sense to a large degree because most of the literature for children that was written by people like Kipling identify these areas. Of course, Mr. Kipling was born in India, So let's continue on. Next is our last character that is somewhat defined, and I just want to point out that the tiger is not very well defined, but he is important, and that may be because it's just this kind of strange, empty force of destruction. We'll get into the tiger idea a little bit more. Anyway, the hippopotamus is wallowing in the mud and chewing spicy hippo food, plankton food. So in other words, chewing on what may be spicy vegetarian food for whatever reason. That makes me think of a certain kind of an idea, and we'll continue on. The hippo is ignoring the word. What word, I don't know. You could argue that it's simply meant to rhyme with herd in the next line, but I'll go ahead and say that that may be a specific word, or is ignoring the word of the news of what's happening, or is perhaps ignoring the word, the greater word of some religious calling or something like that. And there's a reason why I say that, and that's because this hippo, this spicy hippo food hippo, is surveying a herd. In other words, he's overlooking a herd. A herd of what? Stupid water bison, cattle, or water buffalo. And so the implication is, of course, that this is some form of possibly a religious leader that Mr. Barrett is choosing to judge for, I don't know, not understanding something that is important to Mr. Barrett, perhaps, or perhaps being a little bit of a hypocrite. I don't know. Now, I just want to point out that this song was released in 1970 on the Barrett album. I'm not sure when it was recorded, but obviously, if this reading is correct, Mr. Barrett had been working on this song for a very, very long time in his head. Okay? So, this could cover quite a number of years. He may have worked on it and changed it over time, and picked different kind of painful memories from the past. I don't know. Anyway, let's continue with the song. I'll just point out that it's a little bit judgmental and vindictive. Of course, Mr. Barrett could be a little bit judgmental. I do get the feeling quite often that he tries to. Now, this is just my opinion now, okay? This is just my opinion, but he seems to try and do the best and expect the best, but people tend to not meet up to his very rigorous expectations, which is not uncommon in very spiritually driven and, I would say, very intelligent people. They tend to be incredibly judgmental. So he may be quite judgmental here in this statement. And of course, if this is from a religious leader's point of view, they may be looking at Mr. Barrett and saying, geez, this guy, he's pretty wound up, and he obviously has a lot of pain and suffering, so it's kind of hard to talk with someone like that, and it's definitely hard to give someone like that kind of a position of some authority because you don't know what they're going to do with it. Emotional stability is, of course, very important in the development of a person, and if there is something I would say in my study of Mr. Barrett that he struggled with, it would be emotional stability. That would, I think, be his greatest flaw. At any rate, let's continue on. The jungle took fright. In other words, everyone's worried and they're running around all day and night, but they don't have to worry because the tiger came and talked to the inferior one and said, he's not going to hurt anybody. He wants something to eat, and you're all too scant or too small. Oh, yeah. So he ate the elephant. Okay, so I guess I'll try and you can go ahead and look at a picture of Mr. Barrett, Max Barrett. It's on Wikipedia. You can check it out, and he does have kind of a tiny eyes and a big nose look to him. He's a little bit goofy looking. I would say he's a little bit of what I would consider to be a lovable, goofy person. Someone that would seem to be easily relatable to, and quite likely is quite capable. You can read about Max Barrett if you like, and definitely his colleagues and everyone had a very high kind of opinion of the man, and it's probably well deserved. So, of course, now Syd Syd Barrett's going to look at that and think, wow, not only is his dad kind of goofy, but he's also a really kind of a wonderful form of a goofy, I guess you could say. I don't know. The question is, of course, how can such a person that's doing all this good and getting along with people, and how can they be struck down by some omnipotent force or something like that with a disease like cancer? And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but these are the types of questions that religious leaders get all the time, I'm sure, from people that are dealing with loss. And I don't know what they say. I don't know how many of them are trained in dealing with something like that. I doubt many of them are psychologists or psychiatrists. All I know is that when I have to deal with pain, and I have had to deal with pain in my life, something like this, perhaps not quite as, it's all relative to a person's existence. Honestly, there's no way of knowing how a person is going to react to different things, but the nature of those things is that they make you value what you have left more. I don't know how to describe that better, but when I've lost things that are very important to me, I have realized the value of the things that I have left, the relationships that I have left, and the dreams that I still have, and hope to eventually kind of work through and get through on some level. So, at any rate, I imagine that's stuff that they kind of bring about. I don't know. But let's go ahead then, and I guess I'll just kind of move on. So I will start with Mr. William Blake, and the reason for that is because I prefer William Blake, but also because he has a tiger reference in his poem Tiger, Tiger. So let's check out what his poem says, and I'll kind of make notes as we read through it. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye framed thy fearful symmetry? Now the whole thing rhymes, so I'm not sure why eye and symmetry don't rhyme. Perhaps it used to rhyme in Old English. I don't know. Eye and symmetry. Perhaps symmetry used to be the pronunciation. I don't know. At any rate, so tiger, tiger, which is all capitals, okay? Burning bright. And there's forests of the night. So what are the forests of the night? The forest of the night is unconscious, the kind of dreams, the spirit realm. So this is not a normal tiger. This is more like a destructive tiger, a spiritually destructive tiger, or thereby the embodiment of evil and destruction. What immortal hand or eye? So right there is the question. What immortal thing made you? Let's do the next. And of course, fearful symmetry. So the thing is kind of a dreaded figure. The next verse. In what distant deeps or skies burned that fire within thine eyes? On what wings dared he aspire? What the hand dared seize the fire? There's numerous references to fire there, which is again another destructive force. The next verse, and what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? When thy heart began to beat, what dread hand formed thy dread feet? Now, by feet, of course, that means claws. And I just want to point out that the sinews of the heart are mentioned as being twisted. In other words, this thing has a twisted heart. What the hammer, what the chain, knit thy strength and forge thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp, dared thy deadly terrors clasp? Clasping deadly terrors means tying all these deadly terrors into one form. When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Now, the he and his and he are all in capitals. Therefore, this is a reference to God. And it's asking the very simple question that many Christians ask, which is, if God is this omnipotent, goodly force that wants to reduce suffering and pain, why is he making this destructive force? Why is he making death? Why is he making this kind of terrible creature that causes pain and suffering, and indeed even seems to revel in it? This is, as we said, very similar to the story of the book of Job. I don't have answers for that. Okay, I just want to point out that William Blake is considering those things and asking those questions, and perhaps he's trying to engender other people to ask those questions as well. Now, before we move on, I want to point you back to Mr. Rob Chapman's book. Hopefully I said Rob Chapman and not Graham Chapman before. Very Irregular Head. Now on page 43, and yes, I am a Monty Python fan, so that would explain why I would say Graham Chapman. There is a personal kind of a discussion by some people that knew Mr. Barrett, and by Mr. Barrett I mean Syd Barrett, Roger Syd Barrett, saying he didn't really fit in with other people. He was kind of always moving around with other groups, and he could be very untrusting of people, and was a bit shy. So there, and that's from school time now. Okay, so people that say that he suddenly changed personality years later, I think were either completely oblivious or perhaps were caught up in whatever Mr. Barrett was choosing to present them with as a face of who he was. And it's reasonable, one would think, if you go through a very difficult period of time, to try to present those types of things. So what I want to point you to now is, and I will point out that Mr. Blake and Mr. Kipling are from, the great empire, the great British Empire period, when the sun never set on the British Empire. And of course, perhaps that optimism is captured in their stories. Perhaps Mr. Orwell hated Kipling because of that imperial mindset, I suspect. If you read through these stories, you will see that Mr. Kipling could be a little bit condescending. He was kind of a classicist, I guess you could say, in my opinion. But the stories stand as they are and are still valuable, worth reading, I would say. So, Stories and Poems Every Child Should Know by Mr. Kipling. The first, I'll give you other information, I'll put it up there on the screen. The first story is about the elephant's child, and the elephant's child wants to know, what does the crocodile eat? The ostrich spanks him and tells him to go away. The giraffe does the same. The baboon does the same. The hippopotamus does the same. So here we're seeing some of the same animals that have been called out before. Of course, the elephant here, there's a hippopotamus in this story as well. And he gets to the river, and the crocodile, of course, what the crocodile eats is you. And so the crocodile decides to try and eat the elephant child. And there is a snake there. I believe it's some form of a boa or a python. And it helps, actually, the elephant escape from the crocodile. Now, these are very interesting symbols for specific reasons. And I don't want to get into it too much, I guess you could say. But let's just consider that in a story like Peter Pan, of course, the crocodile represents death. In Egyptian mythology, it represents the judgment of the heart. And I've done a song for that. I'll link it. And that discusses the Book of the Dead and the judgment of the heart at that point in time. So the crocodile represents time and death, and this kind of extremely patient waiting for someone to grow weak or vulnerable and then just kind of swallowing them up. That's kind of the method of a crocodile, which is quite disturbing to consider. So, why is a snake helping the elephant? I don't know. That's a little bit opposite of what you would think that a Christian author might present in some circles, I guess you could say. Not everyone believes, of course, that snakes are as they are represented. For the Gnostics, of course, the snake does not mean what the serpent means to other types of Christians. I'll just say that. You can read about that if you choose. So that is interesting that the snake helps to rescue this young child, and which makes you kind of wonder. The next story is how the camel got his hump. And of course, there is a reference to a camel in Mr. Barrett's song, Birdie Hop, as one of the representations of himself. The next story is about a cat that walks by himself. Interestingly, Mr. Barrett, as we discussed, Lucifer Sam, may be a self-analysis, and perhaps this cat is walking by himself the same way Mr. Barrett kind of had to walk by himself. Roll Down to Rio is number 9. I don't know if it's just a poem or what. It's page 80 in my book. I've never sailed the Amazon. I've never reached Brazil. But the Don and Magdalena, they can go there and they will. I've never seen a jaguar, nor yet an armadillo, dilloing in his armor, and I suppose I never will. There's a reference to a jaguar, which will be in a later song, and an armadillo, of course, which we just discussed in the song Julia Dream. Now, of course, that supposedly isn't written by Mr. Barrett. It is supposedly written by Mr. Waters. The next story I'll discuss is Wee Willy Wonka, and has his propensity for nicknames, which we have already discussed. And then the last thing that I'll point to is story 15, which is a selection from Mowgli's Brothers, which discusses the Jungle Book and how the young human child, is being hunted by Shere Khan, this twisted, malevolent force of death, pain, suffering, and is somewhat outside of what I guess would be considered to be a normal form of life. Now, Mowgli is taken in by a group of wolves. Of course, Mr. Barrett does also make a wonderful song called Wolf Pack, and perhaps there's some other thought process going on there. So that's up for you to decide, really. The nature of the wolf pack, and of course that being that it is a natural kind of a family unit, which would have been something that maybe Mr. Barrett looked back on with quite a bit of happiness, as if that was the height of his life. And in many ways, you could say these stories are kind of the height of British life as an empire, anyway. So we've talked through quite a few things there. I'm not sure what else to discuss. I wanted this to be really short and positive, but as I dug into the song itself, I began to realize that it was very similar to the idea of Paint It Black, where the song can be easily and is almost always taken to mean that there is a funeral happening. The flowers and my love both never to come back. And that seems to be indicating that there's a funeral happening, but of course you could read it as a wedding. We've discussed that in A Painting Black, and here I will point to the idea that what may actually be happening is that the effervescing elephant knows that he is going to die and is trying to protect the little one, or in other words, what could be his own son, from the pain and suffering that this young teenager is being exposed to, and will undoubtedly associate with an inevitability in his own life eventually. So I guess that's it for this episode. If you would, give a share, a like, subscribe. Feel free to make comments, as I said. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you later.